Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, these are odd times politically. A lot of fear, confusion and anger about. Not much clarity about alternatives, more protest than programmes. So today we're going to be looking at how the arts are responding or failing to respond to troubled times. Peter Kosminsky, whose television dramas and documentaries on everything from child abuse to the death of David Kelly and modern Israel, is with me, alongside one of the most influential modern art curators in today's London, Iwona Blaswick of the Whitechapel Gallery. Sarah Gillespie is a singer-songwriter who deals with political subject. Her last album was called In the Current Climate, and her new album features songs such as The War on Trevor, and she sings the Shami Chakrabarti Blues. We're going to start with music, opera indeed, featuring newspaper columnists, bankers, collapsing marriages, a Berlusconi-style satire, all painlessly inserted into a 19th century satire, Orpheus and the Underworld by Offenbach. And the man doing the painless inserting is Rory Bremner. Rory, this is an opera which scandalised Paris when it was first produced, I think, didn't it? It was a pretty brutal take on Greek myth.
It did. Well, it was a satire on two levels, really. Well, first was Greek myth. He took the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, the two great lovers, and Eurydice dies and Orpheus goes down to the underworld to get his love back. And Offenbach and his librettist turned that on its head, so in fact they can't stand each other, and Orpheus in fact frog-marched down to hell by public opinion, so scandalised by the idea that he should be delighted that his stroppy and faithless wife has died. But that was on one level, but on the other level it was a satire of the Second Empire, and Jupiter, Zeus, was particularly a sort of caricature of Napoleon III, who was the kind of Berlusconi of his day, and there were lots of references. But the trouble is, of course, now, our knowledge of Greek mythology is not as perhaps as ready as the French was in the sort of mid-19th century, and also those references are kind of lost to us today. So the idea was to update it and make it fun again.
And what you've done is you've brought in sort of newspaper columnists, and you've brought in lots and lots and lots of current references to bankers and so on. One obvious question is, why bother with Offenbach? Why go all the way back to the 1870s? To do something like this?
The short answer is because they asked me, because Scottish Opera were doing, it's part of their sort of outreach programme, they were doing something which is touring all the way around Scotland, and it's kind of happens every 2 or 3 years. I get asked to translate something, and this just landed on my desk. And to begin with, I kind of resisted it, because I enjoy Offenbach's music, but I thought it was a little bit twee and sort of very bucolic.
It's got the can-can in it, this one.
It has, absolutely. You might not think you've heard it before. It has got the can-can, which in the original was the Gallop from Hell, because all the gods, there's a coach trip down to hell. It sort of grew on me, and I realised that the references to the Second Empire could be updated. I mean, what you mentioned about newspaper columnists, because this character of Public Opinion is very much the sort of the Belle Mooney or the Melanie Phillips or the kind of those characters. So she is very much she is the kind of stentorian voice of disapproval, and we have that in our newspapers nowadays. So it's a chance to reference that. And I'd say the gods, who are sort of bored and decadent and fed up with their life, now that sort of translates into the masters of the universe that we have, which are no longer the sort of aristocrats, but now the bankers and financiers, and to some extent the politicians. So I thought I could have fun with it, but it's not a profound satirical work. It's a romp.
It's a romp, and there's plenty of places for romps. But one of the problems I would have thought is, how do you get real satirical bite? Because we've gone through the bankers, as it were, and it's pretty hard.
We haven't started yet, I don't think.
I was going to say, what are the targets that make people sit back in their seats and go,
Yes, this is
newspapers.
Partly because actually the line that sort of is, there's a couple of lines which is the most relevant. One is when the newspaper person, she sort of threatens Orpheus with if you don't actually go down to hell, I've got sort of various things that she can do, and she says, we'll hack your phone, we'll do this and that, and she'll say that you'll find that we moralists can be very immoral when we want to be, and so there's that current reference. But apparently the one that gets the biggest laugh, because I've not seen it myself yet, because I'm looking forward to seeing it at the Young Vic, is the reference to a disgraced banker who is it's reduced in sort of shabby clothes, and he's now Eurydice's jailer. But this isn't really. I don't think this is the vehicle for the kind of darker satire that I would like to do. And I think it kind of opens up the whole question about satire. This is a more popular kind of entertainment, and I don't think it would carry the weight of something which makes the audience sort of grimace or wince in pain. I think it has satirical references, but I mean, I would very much enjoy the chance to do something which is.
How would you do that? Would you write a theatre piece? Is that how you'd do it, or a film piece?
The way we used it was obviously with Bremner, Bird and Fortune, and we had the space and the time, and particularly John Bird and John Fortune. Still, their clip on the subprime mortgage is the kind of text, really, of anybody wanting to understand the subprime thing.
Why don't we see more of this?
Well, I don't know. We haven't got an opportunity at the moment to do it. But that was the kind of television that we made, because a lot of what we do is just topical comedy, and that's the kind of stuff that gets commissioned now because it is topical comedy. And satire is a little bit darker. You need time. You need time to open up the arguments, and that's what John Bird and John Fortune were able to do, because they were able to explore and test these arguments to destruction. We did do a series called Silly Money, but people are beginning, I think, just now, we're beginning to see people are coming to terms with the banks.
Well, I was going to ask, because we seem to have moved to a different phase. Back in the Thatcher years, in the New Labour years, there was a great number of kind of larger-than-life, relatively easy to caricature, extraordinary figures and characters. And there was a great appetite for seeing them lampooned. Now we have a political class which is much duller to look at, perhaps, and to listen to, and yet the issues are more important. So we need to be in a different phase.
Yeah, from an impressionist's point of view, that's quite difficult, because you use the characters to hang things on. And I mean, as I say, they are quite bland, and I've said this sort of many times before, and even Nick Clegg, I bumped into him the other day, and he said, "Oh, hi, Roy, can you do me?" And I said, "No, can you?" Because it is, and even Miliband, because Miliband, it sounds like something to do with the internet, Miliband, and the whole parts of the country that can't get Miliband, and they can only just get cable. But that's the kind of, that's the territory that we're in, so there's no to hang it on. But the other problem is that this issue, the banking thing, is very technical, and the trouble is that the banks, they own the language, all this stuff about double dip and quantitative easing and all these kind of things. So it seems incredibly complicated, but in fact it's very, very simple. And part of the problem is finding a way in, because when we did Silly Money, you end up a lot of the time, because it's complicated, a lot of the time you end up with this kind of satirical exegesis, really. Well, but really, I think we need to sort of get into it, and we need to engage, and we need to, because we're given the sense that this is beyond our understanding. But you realise the whole point about the bank thing is it was obviously beyond their understanding as well. Absolutely.
I'm interested in Peter Kosminsky's view on this, because Peter, your films have very often centred inevitably around vivid moments. There's violent confrontations, and there's kind of rows inside families, or indeed inside countries. There's war and so on. Much harder to make drama possibly about something like the banking crisis, or the collapse of the Eurozone, or the difficulty of kind of balancing what you do for younger people and jobs against the older people, and the worries about inflation with quantitative easing, all those sort of things that are out there floating. They're just much more abstract.
Yeah, and I think Rory's making a really good point. We think we're quite satire-rich in our British media, certainly in television, but it's always commissioned as comedy, a satirical comedy. Have I got news for you, and other examples. Satire can be much darker than that. If you think back to a satirist like Swift, who wrote a pamphlet called A Modest Proposal, which suggested that the way to deal with child poverty was for us to eat children, and it would kill a number of birds with one stone. You didn't raise a laugh. It was dark, dark stuff. And I personally, I think people feel very angry now about what's happened, and they're looking for a darker kind of satire, and we don't have the outlets to provide it.
Do you think that by turning satire into mass entertainment comedy, television has therefore done the culture a disservice?
Well, in fairness to television, and particularly, BBC One, for example, that's its job. It takes something that's out there on the fringes, BBC Two, BBC Four, on the Edinburgh, or wherever it is. It brings it on board, and it unicizes it. Yeah, I can't think of the right word, but that'll do. It
snips it.
It snips its balls off. Let's be blunt. And in a way, you then look for the next thing coming through. And I don't think we need to look to the traditional areas of sort of BBC Two entertainment for our satire. It's going to emerge from a sort of darker, and it's going to come, I think, from student movements, which is where we look to for our salvation at the moment.
Iwona.
I also think that Rory's point about the complexity and the abstraction of it, people are trying to deal with the whole history of capitalism. It's very removed. There's not an obvious victim. It's not like the civil rights movements of the 60s, where it was very clear there was a victim, there was an ethos of protest, because you could identify the issues in a very coherent way, whereas now we're in a much less vivid, less black and white kind of situation, where we're in a land of euphemisms. We're in a place where language has abstracted the actual issues and been taken over by monetarism. And so it's much more difficult to identify an enemy and represent them.
We're also told there are no alternatives. This is the thing, that we are stuck in this situation. And so, I mean, we've referred to it in the comedy thing as it's like a rabbit sitting in the middle of the road. And Osborne's saying, let's bang it on the head. Vince Cable's saying, well, can we take it to a vet and do it humanely? And Miliband is saying, well, we have to put it down, but let's do it slowly. And Chris Huhne's saying, it's not my fault the wife was driving. But essentially, it's the same solution. There isn't an alternative that's been properly articulated. And so everyone's saying, cut, austerity, which ironically, the New Deal and American history would suggest is the wrong way to go about it.
But we mustn't put too much pressure on the arts to come up with programmes and solutions which are not the job of the arts, presumably, Sarah. I mean, you refer a lot to current... We'll talk about your music later on, but you refer a lot to current politics in your music, but often glancingly and obliquely, it's part of the surrounding landscape that you're living in. You're not sitting there with a kind of alternative economic strategy of the Tony Benn days.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think it's really my job to assess the world and provide a diagnosis and a cure. Politics, shapes our reality, albeit invisibly. So in what I do, it's sort of always in the background. It's referenced, and I do think that artists now are incubating on all of these issues, and it takes time to come up with a response. I mean, if you think that Hollywood didn't really cope with the Vietnam War for about 10 years, I think the only movie made about Vietnam War during the war was a John Wayne pro-war film. So there's a muteness at the moment that I think will just remedy itself.
Peter, you've got this whole look back at Peter Kosminsky session coming up, looking at 30 years that you've spent making drama and documentaries. It's called Making Mischief. And you've, as we said, you've chosen a very wide range of subjects to make films on. But we're just starting to talk there about the uneasy balance between entertainment and genuinely dark, challenging, questioning satire, and you have jumped across. I mean, you've gone from the early, as it were, straight documentaries to believing that to really grip people's imaginations and emotions, you have to move further into the world of drama, because that's how you engage them. I'm thinking of something like the Peter Kelly film or The Promise, which you made about the story of Israel.
Well, I went to Afghanistan in the late 80s while the Russians were still there, and it was a scary trip. We made a documentary that we were all quite proud of, won lots of gongs and all the rest of it, and virtually nobody watched it. And I started to ask myself, why am I doing this? Why am I, placing myself and my crew in harm's way to make something that we're really proud of, and absolutely nobody watches it? And it coincided with a point when we were trying to do something about John Stalker and his inquiry into the killings in Northern Ireland back in the 80s. And there was just no way to do it as a documentary.
No interviewees.
Nothing to film but guilty buildings, as we used to say. It suddenly seemed obvious that the way to do it was to dramatise it, and I began initially being sort of pedantically, the wallpaper had to be the correct colour, never use a line of dialogue when, you couldn't justify it, you couldn't prove that those words had actually uttered from that individual's mouth. As time's gone on, and I've been doing it now for over 20 years in the drama area, my attitude has slightly changed.
And I suppose one of the obvious dangers of that is, if the drama works, if it's vivid, it then blurs in the mind of the observer what was true and what wasn't. I now know at some deep level that Dr. David Kelly looked and sounded as Mark Rylance played him. I mean, that's, that is, that with that beard on his hair, face and all the rest of it, that is how I see him, and that's how I remember what he did in Iraq. And of course, it's that ain't so quite. It's
a tool that has to be used carefully. I remember being I did a film for the BBC, one of the few I've done, called Warriors, about the Bosnian War, and sitting in an extraordinary occasion called the Programme Review in the basement of Television Centre with a lot of BBC executives, where they all sit round and discuss the week's output. And the deputy head of news of the Times saying, I don't know why we bothered sending reporters in every day, day after day, when, you come along 2 or 3 years later and you make this drama, it's watched by 9 million people and you have far more impact. And what I was trying to say to him at that meeting was you need both. We build this is what Sarah was saying, you build your reflection years later on the shoulders of that incredible daily reporting, but you also need the ability to reflect in drama in after a period has elapsed.
Absolutely. But if you take something like The Promise, where you have a very gripping drama, as it were, a fresh drama, starting from scratch, and you can see you can see the world through the eyes of Israelis, and you can see the world through the eyes of the British and the Palestinians. By the end, there is a very angry, powerful message, and you have been drawn through as a viewer, trying to balance this and that, and you suddenly find, actually, no, you're on the end of something which has been hugely controversial, as you know.
Well, going back to your original point, which this is sort of augments, really, I moved on from that the wallpaper has to be the same colour approach to one very simple philosophy, really, in writing a show like The Promise, which is not to be misleading. Above all, do not mislead. Do not present a scene which was actually an amicable discussion between 4 or 5 people as a full-on row between 2 people in a closed room. That's misleading. Don't do that. And as long as you don't mislead, and the lawyers are
you
usually...
could be didactic.
Now, in the case of The Promise, which did end up angry and very pointed, you're right, we had something like 85 interviews with British veterans from the British Mandate deployment, in the mid-1940s in Palestine. And a very clear message came through from those interviews, which was that they arrived in Palestine, as it was then called, very pro-Jewish because of what they'd seen in the Second World War. And by the end, after they'd been shot at, kidnapped, bombed, confined to barracks, seen what was going on, they had all become pretty pro-Arab. And I needed to reflect that, otherwise it would have been misleading. Now, of course, if you look at it in absolute terms, that our soldier character ended up pretty pro-Palestinian, but that was simply not being misleading in relation to the research. That was
telling a story that you felt hadn't been told. So, it seems to me, looking across the range of your films, that one theme that recurs again and again and again is the effect of what we, the British, do out there in the world on the British at home. It comes back again and again, whether it's Northern Ireland, whether it's Israel-Palestine, whether it was the Bosnian War again. A lot of your films are, people who turn to drink and violence and the effect. Is this because you feel that we have been too fast as a country to cancel out the rest of the world and our effect on it and its effect on us, and to kind of huddle down with our reality television and our self-congratulation?
Interesting question. Well, at its root, The Promise, which is a programme I worked on for 11 years, was about another messed up British decolonisation. And I wanted to make a film which drew the British public's attention to the fact that we look at the catastrophe that is Israel-Palestine and think, well, it's terribly sad, but it's nothing to do with us. Nothing could be further from the truth. We were the colonial power in charge when that fragmentation of that region took place. And so, yes, I suppose I am often trying to remind us of our kind of international obligations. At that point, when we were also trying to get out of India, when we were bankrupt after the Second World War and it's amazing to think of this now. We took an £8 billion loan from the United States. Imagine what that's worth today.
Well, we only paid it off a few years ago.
And,
I mean,
Britain was
3 or 4 years
bankrupt and busily trying to withdraw from as many of its international obligations as it possibly could. We had a standing army of 1 million, So, and there are consequences to that, and people all over the world are dealing with those. And as a dramatist, we obviously seek to reflect that.
What do the rest of us make of these films? Rory?
Well, I'm a fully paid up Kosminsky fan but I think what he does is I think it's quite right, starting with the initial reports, but distilling that, and I think the idea that he is editing and putting his own spin on it, but any editor who is doing a documentary is doing the same kind of thing. So I think there are choices to be made in how you present something. But in something like The Government Inspector, I think we were all wondering about this whole David Kelly thing, and also the dossier in the Hutton inquiry. And just as I think it was Mark Damaso, who's the head of youth, who said, why are we doing these documentaries when this has more force? I think a lot of people said that because of the Kelly documentary, that was what propelled the impetus for it to have another inquiry into the circumstances.
Well, actually, Andrew McKinley, who was Labour MP, who was on the select committee that interviewed David Kelly, shortly before he committed suicide, said on a BBC programme that show prompted the Chilcot inquiry. And as a dramatist, of course,
that's what you want.
That's what you want to feel, that you are promoting the debate.
Iwona?
I think also that we're bombarded with information, news bulletins, a constant sort of flow of data, if you like. And what these dramas do is give it meaning. They give it interpretation, and they also, I think, show how the big forces, the big seismic convulsions of history manifest themselves at a very individual level, that the past surfaces like the return of the repressed in the present, and in the sort of minute details of a dialogue or an interchange, that people become in a way symptoms of these huge geopolitical events, and that we can't escape them. But they also become more communicable, more understandable through the filter of drama, because then you can relate to it, you can empathise with a character, and it's not, again, this very simple either positioning of facts or ideology. This is bad, this is good. It's more subtle than that.
Just coming back to where we started at the beginning of this is perhaps what we lack at the moment in politics. We don't have the big storytellers. We don't have the politicians who stand up and say, the world is shaped this way, that's how it fits together, and this is what it means, and this is therefore what we must do about it.
Well, we've gone the opposite direction. We've got the technocrats. We've got who are sort of the sort of minutiae of detail,
pulling the clock to pieces.
Absolutely.
And saying this is. Yeah.
Well, it's what we used to do with the Bremner Bird and Fortune. I used to say that we had to make sense of things before we then made nonsense of them again, if you like. And I think maybe it is the job of the artist or the dramatist, or indeed the comedian, to make sense of all this, because there is so much out there that it is difficult to comprehend it. But if you can use these forms to make sense of it, to distill it down, in fact, and then send it out and say, well, this is how we see it as artists, comedians and performers, and invite either agreement or disagreement.
Well, Iwona, Blaswick, let's turn then to the plastic arts, as it were, though, of course, there's plenty of video shown in art galleries these days as well, and much else. But to the contribution made or not made by the painters and the image makers. Your gallery, the Whitechapel Gallery, has a long history of sort of political engagement. It was famously where Picasso's Guernica was shown before the Second World War, and it's one of the galleries which has always had an ambition to say things beyond the purely artistic.
Well, I think it's an example of the kind of utopian impulse in art, because it was founded in 1901 to bring art to the people of the East End of London, in the firm belief that art could change people's lives, that they could actually, in a way, be brought to not only self-realisation, but some kind of agency. And at the moment in London, actually, at the Royal Academy in the forecourt, there is Tatlin's Tower, one of the great abiding symbols of that utopian impulse of artists feeling that they could not only trigger revolution, but also give it a shape, give it an aesthetic, a form. So the Whitechapel, I think, is very much part of that in its very kind of founding mission. But I think it also becomes a platform for different ways of art to interact with politics and culture. Art that, like Guernica, holds up a mirror to injustice. Art that, voices a protest against inequity, injustice. But there's also a place for it, I think, to show the invisible. And that's a very crucial part of, I think, art and politics, which is to make visible that which is invisible, to give a platform.
Those are all, the way you frame it, is all from the left. But isn't it the case also that when the Whitechapel was formed, there was a big tradition of narrative art, what people felt was elevating the sensibilities of those watching it, which would be small c conservative, that great tradition of sort of Victorian narrative art, whether it's historical painting or whether it's about family painting with a strong moral base. And I wonder whether some of the people who formed the Whitechapel Gallery thought that that was the kind of art that they were bringing to the East End.
Without question. I mean, our founders were very much in love with the Pre-Raphaelites because they always had a very strong moral message. They were very uplifting. And yes, they were then criticised as being a form of escapism, that actually people would forget about the daily drudgery and in fact not come to revolution, but actually think about the afterlife, think about religion, about some other form that would be transformative and would actually prevent them from organising themselves into political action. And I think that's the tension between those two.
And sticking with the question of narrative art or art that tells a story and jumping right up to date, you've got an exhibition by the Polish artist William Sasnal at the moment, which... Wilhelm Sasnal, I should say, which is sort of narrative in the sense that he takes lots of images from newspapers and the internet and things he's seen, and he gives you something that may refer to a story or a bit of a story or the edge of a story, and the more you know about the paintings, perhaps the more they're going to mean to you. There's a very striking painting of a rather beautiful African woman who it turns out was involved in genocide, for instance. So tell us a little bit about where narrative painting is at the moment.
Well, Sasnal is interesting in that after a history of abstraction, he uses figurative painting. And he grew up in communist Poland. He was born in 1971, but came of age at the time when it all collapsed. So he actually spans two different ideological systems. He spans a shift of power from east to west. And what he tries to do is use himself as a sort of filter. And his paintings, I think, are like a flow of consciousness. So he'll be working in his studio, he'll paint the cat sitting on top of a filing cabinet. He'll be listening to the radio, he'll be looking out of the window, he'll paint a sunset, he'll think about his family, his son, and then he'll paint what he hears on the radio. So suddenly you get the flash of current affairs. He'll paint a nuclear power station in Iran. He'll surf the internet as we do, and something will pop up. He has painted an image of an Arab, of an African woman, and these are, I think, a way of trying to show how these giant geopolitical events find subjective expression.
So, because he's also requiring the person looking at the painting, the audience, to do a fair amount of work too. It seems to me it's so this may or may not be a shared image. The Pre-Raphaelites had a whole series of shared reference points, religious and Arthurian or whatever they might be, and he's saying to us these might be shared reference points, but there's an amazing painting, I think, of a pig farm or a piggery, which does look strikingly like a concentration camp, for instance. But he doesn't say anything about that. He just gives you the image and lets your mind work it through.
His ambition is to see, can a painting be like a film? That he wants to try and compress cinematic narrative and cinematic time into a single still image. And I think he has a way of bringing in all sorts of associations, anxieties, fantasies, and encapsulating them in a single picture. He lives in Krakow, and as someone once said, if you take a tourist coach out of Krakow, there are only two destinations, the salt mines and Auschwitz. So it's a sort of daily reality that the history of that area is very, very present in the lived reality of contemporary Poland.
One of the questions is whether artists at the moment are doing much, enough, too much about the troubled times in which we live. Is one of the problems that we've got, as with football, such a star system in the arts these days that the really influential people are incredibly rich. I'm thinking of people that you used to work with, like Damien Hirst. I mean, we read in the paper last week, Anish Kapoor is one of the richest men in Britain now. I mean, he's just staggeringly rich. Quite hard to keep your kind of radical street edge when you're living in huge piles in the countryside.
I think the system, the market system, the celebrity system, almost exists separate to the individual. That in my experience of artists, they have this daily practice of going into the studio, regardless of what's happening
Doing
around them, and really diving very deep into their own psyche, into their own understanding of the world. Gerhard Richter is another case in point, a wonderful show at the Tate Modern at the moment, where he has juxtaposed images of abstraction, of flowers with images of the Baader Meinhof. And I think they are quite separate. It's true that people can get cocooned from the kind of experience of politics as ordinary people live it, the wealthier they may become. But I actually feel that most great artists have a level of integrity and something that drives them. They can't stop, whether they're successful or not.
But it's not necessarily a clear political programme or anything like that. I mean, there've been very obvious examples of political art. Mark Wallinger doing his sort of Brian Hoare protest piece in Tate Britain, for example. But most artists refer to politics rather than deal with politics straight on.
I think Sarah's point about being a filter, if you like, something that takes time to absorb into one's consciousness and then try to find a creative expression for it is a tremendous challenge. And I think some artists have just come out and shouted and wanted to launch a protest, but others need that time to absorb what the meaning of it is and to find a form of communicating it, which has an aesthetic power and a philosophical depth to it.
I'm really interested in the location of your gallery and who comes to it, because obviously it's a specific place. It's not like a film that's generated. So who comes to your gallery? It's got obviously a global reputation, but you are there on the edge of the city. And I want, do people come from the city? Because you're just, a stone's throw away. And conversely, if you feel the urge to throw that stone towards the city in the curating and the kind of things that you show them.
Well, it's in a tremendous location because it's it's a bridge, really, if you like. We're very near the great financial engine of Britain, the great powerhouse of Britain. We're also in one of the most diverse cosmopolitan areas of the country. We have a long history of immigration from, the Huguenots to the great Jewish diaspora who came at the end of the 19th century to the South Asian diaspora. We also have 10,000 artists who live and work in one square mile around us.
You're no longer an outpost out there, are you? You're kind of in the heart of achingly trendy East London these days, aren't you?
I mean, that's what we thrive on and want to build on, is the fact that we can create an interface between all these different constituents.
Do you get a lot of city types coming in?
Absolutely. We have art groups from the city. I think people are very engaged and increasingly over the last decade very, very engaged in the visual arts.
Well, the one obvious art form that we haven't talked about yet when we're talking about the arts and politics is the most obvious one, which is the protest song. Sarah Gillespie, you've done I don't know if you'd call them protest songs or not, but you've written about issues such as, Dow Jones and the Hang Seng and the stock market appear in your songs. Rendition appears in your songs. I mentioned earlier you're working on something called the Shami Chakrabarti Blues, which we'll be hearing it, and your last, the War on Trevor, which is obviously a reference to the War on Terror. But if you hear an album that you've made, it is first and foremost a musical album. It's not a sort of early Bob Dylan. Every single song has got a political content number.
True. No, I mean the thing about music, of course, or even if it's a protest song, is it's not a banner and it's not an essay. It's has an aesthetic power, hopefully. So, to use music in that way, or if it ends up being interpreted as having a message, then that's something else.
It's difficult to talk about music in the abstract. Let's just hear a little bit of one of your songs.
They mock me in my chamber with the women they are licking peaches for boys helping some parading me in my knickers and breeches. They said, son, you must be putting me on. You know what, I can't get hated. And I'm gonna make you like your uranium, vicious and depleted.
Cut me off with my best lyric.
Yes.
Vicious and depleted. It's about uranium.
Yes, we heard it. Well, I heard it anyway. Maybe
Slightly depleted, though.
Yeah,
Slightly,
it was depleted.
it was slightly depleted. So you're writing in a world that is political and has lots of issues around that make people angry and make people engaged. When you're settling down to write a song, do you think I'm going to write about rendition, or I'm going to write about this person, or does the song start to come, the lyrics start to come, the music starts to come, and then you're shaping? Well, this is a reference to this, or this is a reference to that. I mean, do you start trying to write a political song?
Definitely not. First of all, I never try to write anything, but I don't. If I'm a political artist, I don't interpret the world in sort of compartmentalised topics. For me, if I'm going to approach a subject, it's completely organic. It's because I'm drawn to it, because I'm either deeply upset by it, or I'm perplexed, and I'm wrestling with it in that way. The Polish artist, sorry, I've forgotten his name.
Willem Sassel.
Yeah, I enjoyed looking at his work so much, and the way that he kind of references things in a very sort of stream of consciousness way, and just makes you feel unsettled. It's kind of always there in the background. It's implied rather than depicted.
Does that mean that a good lyric has to be open rather than closed? In other words, it's got to have gaps for whoever's listening to fit in their own experiences, their own memories, their own responses, rather than being didactic, telling them something?
That's a good question. I suppose, I mean, the most enduring so-called protest songs are malleable enough to be adapted to different scenarios. Take Blowing in the Wind,
Yes.
as a classic example. I mean, other people have different tactics. I couldn't suddenly sit down and write a dirge about tuition fees.
No.
But, some people approach it that way. If you look at, one of the best protest songs, in my view, is Strange Fruit. And I think that part of the power of that is the language. First of all, the language is so poetic, and it's about nature, the smell of magnolia and the sucking wind and the crows, but also the restraint, because whoever wrote the song doesn't enter into the morality, does not say this is barbaric. This
We should
is
say
wrong.
it's a song about lynching. It's
Yes,
in
but
the
at
Deep
no
South.
point does it
that.
actually say that. It just says it's strange. And I think there's something very haunting about just using the word strange.
Peter Kosminsky.
I wondered whether you and you say you never sort of try to force a song, and I understand that, but do you set out to change minds?
I'm not sure if I do. If I do change minds, I'd be very, very happy about it. But I can't say that I have a clear motive to. I think, in terms of art holding a mirror up to injustice, that's a reflex that artists have, and that's one that I have.
So something like War on Trevor, which is very specifically about the question of rendition and British inmates at Guantanamo Bay and so on. That does seem as if you settle down and say, this is something I feel angry about and I want to write about directly.
Well, I must be clear, actually, the War on Trevor isn't even finished or out yet. It's something I'm working on. I just got awarded by the PRS Female Composer Songwriter Scheme to write it, and it's a narrative piece of music, and it's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and now I've sat down and started writing it, and for sure it engages with the many themes. It's kind of like a modern-day Book of Job, where the protagonist, he's never seen and he's never heard. He's more of a mute, blank slate on which lots of people project their anxieties and phobias and revenge.
But a little bit like Rory Bremner's Offenbach take, there are lots of references from certainly what I've seen in terms of the lyrics, Shami Chakrabarti blues. That's the kind of instant cultural reference you might get in a Rory Bremner sketch.
For sure, yeah, there are.
Yeah, I mean, I think, funnily enough, when Sarah was sort of mentioned as a protest singer, then I listened to the album of yours, the most recent album, and it's funny because as a protest thing, you think it's not, as you said, the dirge about tuition fees. It's not something direct. It's not linear. It's much more subtle than that. And as you heard in the song you heard just then, I think it is that stream of consciousness, and there's something that's very intoxicating and subtle, and you start to inhabit that world. It takes several listens until and clearly what is going on in your own mind is you are drawn in and intoxicated by the subject that you're singing about, and it isn't, all right, okay, on the one hand you've got a piece of paper, and on the other hand you've got a musical score, and you're thinking, how can I? And I often wish that I had that the depth that you have. I always feel I'm working much too linear and straightforward a way, but I think yours is much more subtle. I know you're a big fan of Brecht, I know.
Yes,
and Brecht had his own way of doing it, but in some ways he was such a good dramatist that you sometimes wonder whether he lost the political plot.
In the past on this show we've talked about artistic manifestos, and there's a long history of artistic manifestos, but is the conclusion that it is the job of the arts to be saturated and marinated in the times in which they're produced, so surrounded by the politics, but it is not the job of the arts to produce clear programmes or even necessarily answers?
I think it happens organically. And in terms of music, there's other ways for music to be political. The onus isn't always on the lyrical content.
Peter?
We can also offer a chance to reflect. We can step back from we're drenched in the immediacy of coverage now. And certainly, what I think we're all involved in one way or another, even Rory doing it on the week in question, is a reflection on the events.
Iwona?
I think art can also ask what if, and I think that great utopian impulse is to say, if it was ideal, how would it be?
Well, thank you to all my guests. I think that was one of the more interesting conversations we've had for a very long time, actually. Sarah Gillespie's latest album is called In the Current Climate, and The War on Trevor, I've just been mentioning, will be out next year. Iwona Blaswick is director, as we've heard, of the Whitechapel Gallery, and you can presently see that exhibition of Wilhelm Sasnal, and there's also a very interesting exhibition about the Government Art Collection there as well. Making Mischief, a retrospective of Peter Kosminsky's work, will be on at the BFI South Bank throughout December. And Rory Bremner's Orpheus and the Underworld opens at the Young Vic in London at the end of the month, the day of the strike, so we'll wait and see whether it opens or not. We assume so. Next week we're going to be talking about power from dictators to technocrats with Simon Heffer, George Ayeti and Maya Asham. But for now, thank you and goodbye. If you've enjoyed this BBC podcast, why not try some others, such as The Forum, the discussion programme about global ideas. And to find out more, visit bbcworldservice.com/forum. Orpheus and the Underworld by Offenbach. And the man doing the painless inserting is Rory Bremner. Rory, this is an opera which scandalised Paris when it was first produced, I think, didn't it? It was a pretty brutal take on Greek myth.
It did. Well, it was a satire on two levels, really. Well, first was Greek myth. He took the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, the two great lovers, and Eurydice dies and Orpheus goes down to the underworld to get his love back. And Offenbach and his librettist turned that on its head, so in fact they can't stand each other, and Orpheus in fact frog marched down to hell by public opinion, so scandalised by the idea that he should be delighted that his stroppy and faithless wife has died. But that was on one level, but on the other level it was a satire of the Second Empire, and Jupiter, Zeus, was particularly a sort of caricature of Napoleon III, who was the kind of Berlusconi of his day, and there were lots of references. But the trouble is, of course, now, our knowledge of Greek mythology is not as perhaps as ready as the French was in the sort of mid-19th century, and also those references are kind of lost to us today. So the idea was to update it and make it fun again.
And what you've done is you've brought in sort of newspaper columnists, and you've brought in lots and lots and lots of current references to bankers and so on. One obvious question is, why bother with Offenbach? Why go all the way back to the 1870s? To do something like this?
The short answer is because they asked me, because Scottish Opera were doing, it's part of their sort of outreach programme, they were doing something which is touring all the way around Scotland, and it's kind of happens every 2 or 3 years. I get asked to translate something, and this just landed on my desk. And to begin with, I kind of resisted it, because I enjoy Offenbach's music, but I thought it was a little bit twee and sort of very...
It's got the can-can in it, this one, doesn't it?
It has, absolutely. You might not think you've heard it, but it has got the can-can, which in the original was the Gallop from Hell, because all the gods, at the end, there's a coach trip down to hell. it sort of grew on me, and I realised that the references to the Second Empire could be updated. I mean, what you mentioned about newspaper columnists, because this character of Public Opinion is very much the sort of the Belle Mooney or the Melanie Phillips or the kind of those characters. So she is immoral when we want to be, and so there's that current reference. But apparently the one that gets the biggest laugh, because I've not seen it myself yet, because I'm looking forward to seeing it, The Young Vic, is the reference to a disgraced banker who is reduced in sort of shabby clothes, and he's now Eurydice's jailer. But this isn't really. I don't think this is the vehicle for the kind of darker satire that I would like to do, and I think it kind of opens up the whole question about satire. This is a more popular kind of entertainment, and I don't think it would carry the weight of something which makes the audience sort of grimace or wince in pain. I think it has satirical references, but I mean, I would very much enjoy the chance to do something which is.
How would you do that? Would you write a theatre piece? Is that how you'd do it, or a film piece?
The way we used it was obviously with Bremner, Bird and Fortune, and we had the space and the time, and particularly John Bird and John Fortune, still their clip on the subprime mortgage is the kind of text, really, of anybody wanting to understand the subprime thing.
Why don't we see more of this?
Well, I don't know. We haven't got an opportunity at the moment to do it, but that was the kind of television that we made, because...
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, these are odd times politically. A lot of fear, confusion and anger about. Not much clarity about alternatives, more protest than programmes. So today we're going to be looking at how the arts are responding or failing to respond to troubled times. Peter Kosminsky, whose television dramas and documentaries on everything from child abuse to the death of David Kelly and modern Israel, is with me, alongside one of the most influential modern art curators in today's London, Iwona Blaswick of the Whitechapel Gallery. Sarah Gillespie is a singer-songwriter who deals with political subject. Her last album was called In the Current Climate, and her new album features songs such as The War on Trevor, and she sings the Shami Chakrabarti Blues. We're going to start with music, opera indeed, featuring newspaper columnists, bankers, collapsing marriages, a Berlusconi-style satire, all painlessly inserted into a 19th century satire.
Very much. She is the kind of stentorian voice of disapproval, and we have that in our newspapers nowadays. So it's a chance to reference that. And I'd say the gods, who are sort of bored and decadent and fed up with their life, now that sort of translates into the masters of the universe that we have, which are no longer the sort of aristocrats, but now the bankers and financiers and to some extent the politicians. So I thought I could have fun with it, but it is that. It's not a profound satirical work. It's a romp.
It's a romp, and there's plenty of places for romps. But one of the problems I would have thought is, how do you get real satirical bite? Because we've gone through the bankers, as it were, you know, and it's pretty hard.
We haven't started yet, I don't think.
I was going to say, what are the targets that make people sit back in their seats and go,
yes, this is
newspapers.
Well, partly because actually the line that sort of is, well, there's a couple of lines which is the most relevant. One is when the newspaper person, she sort of threatens Orpheus with if you don't actually go down to hell, I've got sort of various things that she can do, and she says, we'll hack your phone, we'll do this and that, and she'll say that you'll find that we moralists can be very